Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Chris Adams. I'm the online community manager for ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Software Requirements, 7 Critical Success Factors. Today's featured speaker is Karl Wiegers. The webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the Q&A session at the end. So be sure to submit your questions in advance using the questions feature of the GoToWebinar software. I'd like to say thank you to digibytes.com for sponsoring this event. Digibytes is the online library of solutions for business analysts and technology professionals, offering resources from on-demand webinars to white papers and case studies. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Karl to get us started.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thanks to Digibytes for sponsoring this webinar. Welcome, everybody, and a special welcome to my friend Barb. Thank you all for joining us today. Here's a little contact information for me and also some of the books that I've written in this area. The presentation I'm going to be giving today is based on the book on the left, Software Requirements 3rd edition, co-authored with Joy Beatty, which was published in 2013. If you've seen the 2nd edition, this is a major enhancement over that with a great deal of additional content and updated material. The book on the right side there is kind of interesting. That's a memoir of life lessons called Pearls from Sand, How Small Encounters Lead to Powerful Lessons. Rather a departure from my software books, but it was a lot of fun to write. You might also find the Consulting Tips and Tricks blog there interesting, even if you aren't an independent consultant. So I've been interested in how project teams can do a better job on handling their requirements for a long time. And in that time, after working with dozens of companies, in fact, well over 100, I've identified 7 factors that I think are critical for success in this domain, and I'd like to share those with you today. So the first factor is having a shared understanding of what requirements even are and why we should care about them. I find that whenever someone comes to me with a question about requirements, the very first thing I have to understand is their terminology, because I could show each of you the same single requirement statement, and you're going to call it lots of different things. Somebody might say it's a functional requirement, or maybe it's a software requirement, a user requirement, a business requirement, a stakeholder requirement, a feature, a user story, constraint, a system requirement, a solution requirement, a lot of different things that we might call this one statement simply because we haven't agreed on a vocabulary. And without a vocabulary like that, then we're going to have a very hard time even communicating about our requirements issues. And this leads to all sorts of confusion and headaches when we don't have a shared understanding of how we're going to cooperate and collaborate on this extremely important foundational part of software development. So some of the kinds of problems that can arise if we don't have this shared understanding and concern is even a matter of understanding what kinds of information are we trying to acquire, and what are we going to do with this? Where does it come from? And along with where does it come from is a question of who is responsible for providing and acquiring this information. Is it something that we get from the project sponsor, or something the business analyst is supposed to decipher somehow from looking at various sources? Is it information that comes from a user or other kind of stakeholder? Maybe it's something that the developer needs to be aware of, such as a technical constraint we're going to have to work with. So we need to have this understanding of what these different kinds of information are that we're trying to accumulate in this big pile we call the requirements, just so we can make sure that we cover all the bases and work together well. Then we have to figure out where are we going to put all this information. If you don't have an established set of document templates or a requirements management tool that you're using for storing this, then you might not be sure where to put each of the pieces of information you accumulate in some consistent way, so readers who need that information know where to find it. And it's a very good idea to ask yourself, whenever you're writing down some piece of information, before you put it into a permanent storage like a requirement spec, ask yourselves, what are we going to do with this? If a developer reads this, what are they supposed to decide to do based on that piece of information? One of the services I've provided for many years is to review requirement specifications for companies. And sometimes I'll be reading through a spec, and there will be some information in there, and I say, okay, I understand this, but what do you want me to do with this? It's not clear to me how I'm expected to use that or how it's of value to me to have it available. And so you can end up collecting information that seems like a good idea, but it's not actually useful to anybody, so why bother? And not everybody even really believes that requirements are important or necessary. So it's a good idea to understand who the audience is for each of the pieces of information that you're recording. And it's a good idea to understand that we do have to have some foundation for building our products. Otherwise, you're going to build it over and over again trying to get it right. I like to think that you're going to get the requirements right eventually. It's just really expensive and painful to get it right at the end after much trial and many iterations and a lot of false starts and a lot of wasted effort. That's a pretty expensive and painful way to build software. Two of the techniques that I'm not going to be talking about today are telepathy and clairvoyance. And I don't talk about those because even though they seem to be widely used as the technical foundation for many projects, I don't think they work very well. So I think we need to spend a lot of time working with a variety of stakeholders on projects to reach this understanding of what information we need to accumulate, who's going to be dealing with each of those pieces of information, how and why we're going to record it in some shareable form, and what we're going to do with it. So let me start with a few definitions here. In fact, I'll start with a pretty basic definition of what is a software requirement. And I've seen many definitions about requirements. I'm sure you have as well. But this is one that I like quite a lot. This is from a couple of guys named Ian Somerville and Pete Sawyer. And they say requirements are a specification of what should be implemented. That is, we're trying to communicate to someone what should we have when we're done with this project. Requirements are descriptions of how the system should behave. That part's pretty straightforward. Those are what we call functional requirements, describe the behavior of the system under certain circumstances. And the vast majority of the requirements information that we accumulate certainly focuses on that kind of knowledge. What's a system going to do or let you do under certain conditions? But there's more to it than that. Requirements are also descriptions of a system property or attribute. And these are examples of the things we call non-functional requirements. A lot of people don't like that term very much because it tells you what something isn't rather than what it is. And I'm sympathetic to that, but non-functional requirements cover a variety of kinds of information. The things we normally think of in this category are quality attributes, things like performance and other things that are often called the illities, usability, portability, maintainability, availability, those kinds of things. And in my experience, even though those characteristics of the product are often critical to customer satisfaction, most project teams do a very, very poor job of exploring and specifying those kinds of quality characteristics. So make sure that that's an important part of your requirements explorations as well. In addition, according to this definition, requirements could be constraints that are imposed on the development process. These could be design or implementation constraints. So I like this definition because it points out that requirements constitute a wide range of information, a variety of kinds of knowledge about our business problem or the solution that we're envisioning for it, and we need to explore all of those. Now, one of the things that I've found is that people butt heads in discussions, and I see it a lot in LinkedIn discussions, for example, where people are talking about requirements with no adjectives in front. And so one person is making some enthusiastic argument about some particular kind of requirement, but since they haven't described it any more precisely than just requirement, people who are then debating with that person or participating in the discussion can often be in violent disagreement, and it's really just a matter of terminology. So we need to put some adjectives in front of the word requirements to distinguish these various kinds of information. So here's a little model that I've been using for many years that I find helpful to get our heads around different kinds of requirements information. There's a saying about models: all models are wrong. Some models are useful. And I think that's certainly true here. This is clearly a simplification of reality, but I find it helpful, and I hope you will as well. So I want to just walk through this for a moment and at least use some terms that I'm going to use consistently for the rest of our time together here today. At the top level are the business requirements. Now, some people use that term to refer to requirements that come from the business about software functionality, but that's not how I'm using it. I'm using the term business requirements to really describe why we are undertaking the project. What, from a business point of view, are we trying to accomplish that will make the world a better place from our point of view. And I like to store that in some kind of a container. I often call it a vision and scope document. You might have something like a project charter, or if you're building commercial software, you might have a marketing requirements document, but some kind of container. It doesn't have to be a printed document, but something that we can use to accumulate this information. And if you go to my website, processimpact.com, you'll be able to find templates for a lot of these kinds of information. So business requirements answer the question why we're undertaking the project, and they set the stage for the rest of the work that we do. But that's not enough information for developers to know what to build. So we need to go down one level. Now here in this diagram, the solid line means that the information coming from the solid line is stored in the thing at the other end, at the arrow end, and the dotted line could mean that these are the origin of or influence the next item down. So the next layer down is the user requirements. User requirements describe what the user will be able to do with the product that we're building. And one good way to represent this is in the form of use cases. User stories is another good way. There's a lot of ways that we can show user requirements, but they're all focused on what users will be able to do. Now, I know many people that have told me, yeah, we wrote our use cases and the users understood them and we gave them to the developers, but developers had a lot of questions because there wasn't enough information in there. And that's because we need to go down to the third level, which are the functional requirements. So if you remember, the business requirements are a kind of why information. Why are we undertaking this project? User requirements are a kind of what information. What will the user be able to do with the product? And you might think I'm going to say how, but that would be wrong, because functional requirements are also a kind of what information. They describe what the developer is going to implement. You don't implement business requirements. You don't implement user stories or use cases. What you implement are little bits of functionality in which the system is going to behave in a certain way under certain conditions. And if these arrows all align, then the users can do the things they need to do because we implemented the right functionality, and if all goes well, we'll accomplish our business objectives. So I like to store the functional requirements along with a lot of other information in a software requirement specification, or SRS. Again, that's just a container. You might choose to store it in a requirements management tool or many other forms. So this is kind of the functional flow of information, but there's more to it, of course. Other kinds of requirements-related information include business rules. Business rules are things like corporate policies, government laws and regulations, industry standards, computational formulas, things like that that we need to keep track of. We also have quality attributes that I just mentioned, these so-called illities. And these things all influence the functionality you implement, and they need to be recorded and stored someplace. One of the categories of non-functional requirements are external interface requirements that describe how our system connects to the rest of the universe. And then we also have these design and implementation constraints that we have to be aware of. So I think it's important to establish in your organization a common vocabulary, including some adjectives in front of the word requirements, so that when the various participants in a project are discussing this very important topic, they will all know what we're talking about, and we'll have a common understanding of how we're going to represent information and where we're going to put it. Now, as I said, not everybody thinks that requirements are important, but in reality, I think they're critical to success. Some people think that taking the time to explore requirements will slow the project down because it just delays the real work of coding. However, studies have found that projects that spend a larger fraction of their time on requirements actually move faster than similar projects that spend less time on requirements. Well, how can that be? So here are some of the reasons why having good requirements can actually accelerate development. First of all, if we do establish some business requirements, and I'll talk more about that coming right up, then we've got a shared vision for the project stakeholders. We have some shared goals and expectations that we can work toward in alignment, and we don't have as many disconnects as if people think we're aiming for different objectives. I think it's critical to have users involved continuously, really, through the development process and the requirements activities. I'm going to talk quite a bit about this as we go along, and that greatly reduces the chance of having the system be rejected at the end because it simply does not meet user needs and expectations. Also, if we have done a good job on our requirements, then we can have confidence that the functionality the developers are going to build will actually enable users to perform the business tasks they need to accomplish. That is, it will let users perform their user requirements. This also helps with kind of a corollary to that, which some of you may have experienced. Perhaps you've been on a project in which people had certain requirements that you somehow got, so you implemented that functionality and no one ever used it. Has that ever happened to you? It's happened to me, and it's really irritating because you spend a lot of time working on those requirements and implementing them and testing them, even if nobody's going to use it. And so let's make sure that we can use techniques that are going to reduce the likelihood of building functionality that just isn't useful for anybody. If we can spend part of our requirements effort focusing on these non-functional kinds of requirements topics, then that helps us define achievable quality expectations. I mean, sure, everybody wants software to respond instantly, to never fail, to always be available when you need it, to do all the things you need it to do, to recover perfectly from any kind of error it might encounter, and so forth. And the fact is, you can't get an optimum balance or a maximum balance of all of those quality attributes. We need to know which ones are most critical to success so that we can make appropriate trade-off decisions and reach the overall best outcome. So let's define achievable, not unrealistic or unnecessary quality expectations. You're going to get the requirements right eventually, and it's a lot more painful and unpleasant to get them after you've built the software and people are using it in production or doing beta testing and then telling you all the things that we've done wrong and things we missed and things we misunderstood and have to go back and fix it. Now, there's always going to be some of that. It's just the nature of the business. But I think we can do a better job of understanding requirements earlier as you're building each chunk of the system, whether that chunk is 1% or 100%. And let's understand the requirements for each chunk as well as we can so we don't have to do as much rework later on because it's so much more expensive to fix problems later than to prevent them earlier. Change is going to happen. That's another thing we'll be talking about as we go along here. And so let's make sure that we've got processes in place so that we can incorporate the right changes in the requirements and in the system appropriately at the right time. I'm a big fan of peer reviews. Peer reviews, having a group of people look at requirements with a critical eye to try to validate them and see if we can find and remove as many errors as we can early. That's, again, much cheaper than delivering the wrong system and having to fix it afterward. So I think just having a common understanding of what requirements are and why they're important will go a long way towards helping you be more successful in this area. The second critical success factor that I've alluded to earlier is this idea of having clearly defined business requirements. You know, people typically think in terms of requirements as describing the system's functionality, and certainly that's a big part of it. But as we saw in that three-level model I showed you a few minutes ago, the top level of requirements are the business requirements. So here I'd like to describe three major components of your business requirements. The first is to establish your business objectives. These are typically going to come from the business problems that you're trying to address or from the market opportunities that you're trying to create or exploit. So let's understand what our business objectives are, and let's try to quantify those as much as possible. A lot of them boil down to financial. In fact, almost all of them will boil down to some sort of financial benefit that we're trying to enjoy from building some sort of software or improving some existing product. So let's try to quantify those so that we can see if it justifies the investment that would be necessary in the product, and also to try to see if we're accomplishing what we intended to. So let's also define some success metrics that we can use. Sometimes these are called, key indicators that will help us understand whether we're going to be able to deliver the customer value and the business value that we think is important. So those are our targets. Those set the stage. Now, sometimes people talk about vision and scope, and sometimes they muddy those together, but I think they're different. I like to talk about a product vision and the project scope. So to me, the product vision is a matter of looking strategically down the road and thinking about a concise description that provides a concept of what this product might eventually become. And so I've got a template, a little keyword template in our book, Software Requirements 3rd Edition, that I find extremely helpful in having people very quickly be able to write a vision statement, no more than half a page, that helps people to align toward this mental notion of what we're trying to build. and that's going to be identifying the key business benefits a system will provide. But we're not necessarily all going to get there in one step. So we need to think about how do we move toward accomplishing this business vision, maybe through an incremental development approach, maybe through a series of product releases, and sometimes all at once. But that project scope is really critical. Scope defines the boundary between what's in and what's out for the project that we're working on or the iteration that we're working on, if you're, say, in an agile approach. And that's really critical because you can only do so much with a given size team in a given time period. So let's make sure we're maximizing the value from the work that we're doing. So priorities become important, and this boundary becomes important so we don't end up working on things that could have waited or maybe we didn't have to do at all. So part of your project scope analysis should include a statement of what limitations and exclusions we have. I saw this done very nicely once at a company in New Zealand, which was building a website for a national sports team, and they had a very nice list of some of the things that this website was not going to let people do that you might otherwise have expected, such as creating virtual teams. That was not something that they were going to do, at least in this release. And so they identified that as a limitation. This is all part of expectation management. So the various stakeholders have a pretty common understanding of what we're going to have when we're done. So by defining the scope like this, it makes it a lot easier for project managers to make project commitments and to prioritize requirements in alignment with achieving those outcomes. And in fact, most of you have probably been on a project that suffered from scope creep, but you can't even say for sure that you're experiencing scope creep unless we had some scope statement in the first place, because creep is really just saying that the scope that we thought we were going to have is a lot smaller than what we're ending up with. So you really need that as a starting point for managing scope creep. There's just not a lot written about how to define scope. And so I want to briefly mention 4 techniques that I found useful for actually recording scope information. The first is a very old diagram called a context diagram. And I don't think just because a technique is old means there's no good reason to use it. That doesn't bother me at all. Context diagram is a very simple picture with a circle and some boxes and arrows, which shows things outside your system that connect to it in some way. So at a very high level, you're getting some information about these interfaces, but you see nothing about the internal system details. So you're really focusing on that boundary between what the system is and the things outside the system that connect to it. The use case diagram from UML that some of you are probably familiar with does show you a little bit of internals about the system. It identifies the system boundary and actors that are outside that boundary and shows how they connect to the system by linking them to specific use cases or tasks that users will be able to perform with the system. So now we're getting a little bit of visibility about the things that are inside that system boundary. A technique I like quite a lot is called a feature roadmap. There are various ways that you can show this, but basically if you're thinking in terms of features on your project, and not everybody does, but if you're thinking of features, then you can often break a feature down into multiple levels of sophistication or enrichment or various sub-features. And then what you can do is you can say for each release or increment that we're going to build, let's allocate to that specific feature levels from the various features that we're planning to do based on priority. And so you can look out into the future and define the scope of several releases or increments based on what portions of each of the various features you're intending to implement. I think this is a really nice technique. Now, not all applications are really amenable to talking about users and use cases, so we might think in terms of using system events as a way to define our scope. Events are triggers from outside your system that stimulate some sort of system response. You particularly see these in real-time systems, but system events can fit in 3 categories: business events, like someone wants to perform a use case, temporal or time-triggered events, and then signal events that are triggered by a sensor or some other external mechanical agent. And these events, then, you can make a list of the events you're anticipating your system might have to deal with, and you can define which ones you're going to actually address in each release as part of a way to manage scope. So I think that this idea of defining your business requirements and then making sure all the work that you do subsequently aligns with those towards achieving your business objectives, that's a critical success factor. Now, probably many of you who are here today with us are business analysts or something like that, perhaps by another name. And so I do think another critical success factor is to have people who are very good at doing software requirements. So we need trained, skilled, and motivated business analysts. The role of the business analyst is always performed by someone on the project, whether it's an actual job title given to a specialist, or whether these activities are fragmented across multiple people who have other real jobs, like maybe a test lead does some of this, and maybe the developers are responsible for requirements for their parts of the project. Well, whenever they're doing that kind of work, they're acting as a business analyst. There are a lot of other titles for a business analyst: requirements analyst, requirements engineer, requirements manager, system analyst, business systems analyst, or just simply analyst. So whatever title it is, some people do distinctions here, like maybe a BA is different from a system analyst, but it's important to have some understanding of what their roles and responsibilities are. And this is primarily a bridging function. I see the BA as really being at the center of coordinating the work that a lot of other team members are doing. They might work with a project sponsor to understand those business requirements we just talked about. They'll often, in fact, almost certainly work with various user representatives to understand their user requirements. And then that information will be developed, elaborated, and translated into functional and non-functional requirements that development will work with, because that's what they're actually going to build. Testers also need to know about those functional and non-functional requirements so they can assess whether we've actually built the right product in the right way. A variety of other stakeholders will have their own expectations and constraints that we need to know about. And the project manager is certainly going to want to know something about how big this project is, how complex it is, so they can make sensible resource allocations and commitments. So the BA plays a central role in coordinating all of these kinds of information coming from these multiple sources and people who have multiple expectations. So the BA is really playing an essential communication role. They need to be able to work with users and understand the application domain. They need to be able to talk with developers in a more technical way to give them the information they need. And a big part of this job is to really translate the user requirements into these more technical requirements. Now, depending on your background, if you're a BA, you might have come from the user side of the world, or you might have come from an IT side of the world. But no matter where you came from, you're probably lacking some knowledge on the other side of this bridge that you're standing on. So you really need to be responsible for enhancing your own skills and knowledge so you can do a really good job of that bridging function. You know, a BA might do a lot of different things. They may do some of these things or maybe all of them. They might be involved with defining business requirements or working with the project sponsor to do so. They often will help identify potential project stakeholders and then user classes as a subset of those. We'll come back to that idea. A big chunk of what they do is around eliciting requirements from various sources and analyzing those to go down into further detail and make sure we understand them and represent the information appropriately. Documenting those so they can be shared and communicated to all those who need to know. They might be involved with leading the requirements validation activities, such as prototyping. They often will facilitate a collaborative approach to requirements prioritization involving multiple stakeholders, and then dealing with changes and tracking requirements as they go from ideas into completed software. So to do this well, you need a lot of skills. And so I would suggest you ask yourself, from this list, which ones do you feel you're pretty good at? Which ones do you feel you ought to learn a little more about? You can actually take classes in listening skills. When I was at Kodak many years ago, I took such a class, although I'm not sure my wife would agree that I actually learned very much. But you can learn how to listen better and, for example, learn how to listen between the lines of what people are actually saying and picking up additional information. A lot of what you do involves interviewing individuals and asking the right questions to get the information you need. A BA needs good analytical skills to be able to look at things from a pretty critical perspective and identify gaps and ambiguities. This is very much a human job, so communication and interpersonal skills are absolutely essential. You also need to be able to do some systems thinking, so we're not just focused on the immediate problem and its immediate environment, but rather see how what we're working on is going to fit into the world that's a little bit broader. Sometimes you're working with groups of people in workshops, and you might need to facilitate those effectively. So all of this involves really a fair amount of leadership, taking the bull by the horns and really getting people to work together in a collaborative way. Sometimes you're watching people do their jobs and learning more than they might have told you on their own, so that's also valuable. Of course, a great deal of what you do is communicating outward, so you need to be able to write well. And sometimes you're writing in a language that's not your native language, and frankly, that's harder. There's a lot of subtleties and nuances and precision issues that can make a difference in how effectively we communicate. So we need to be good at that. But sometimes you don't need to write requirements in natural language. We need to draw pictures. So the ability to choose and create and then modify models, visual models of requirements, is also very important. You're dealing with a great deal of information, much of it collected more or less randomly, and so you need to have good organizational skills. And don't forget creativity. You're not just a scribe. If you're a BA, we also want you to contribute to making suggestions and inventing and discovering requirements. You're not just writing down what people tell you. So this is kind of getting to the next factor, which is that we really need to build a collaborative partnership with customers if we want to be successful. Collaborative partnership is a phrase I use a lot when I'm talking about requirements. So let me kind of show you a little diagram here about that. A stakeholder is an individual, a group, or an organization that is either actively involved in a project, is affected by the process or the outcome of the project, or can influence the process or the outcome of the project. So we have a lot of potential stakeholders we have to deal with. One subset of stakeholders are customers. But there are other kinds of stakeholders as well. We're going to focus on the customer side. And we can subdivide our customers into both direct and indirect users, people who touch the product with their own hands and people who maybe get outputs from it or deliver inputs to it. And then other kinds of customers who might be involved in specifying needs or acquiring a commercial package. But the whole point of this slide is that we can subdivide our set of users into various user classes. And I think this is a really important thing to do. We don't want to just talk about users as though they're a monolithic set of people with similar needs, because most projects, most products of any size are going to have a variety of classes of users. Some of them may be favored user classes. In other words, meeting their needs is strongly aligned with achieving our business objectives. There may be actually disfavored user classes, such as people who want to hack into systems. Just today, in fact, I found out that one of my credit cards has been compromised. So obviously somebody got that number from somebody where I bought something. And we would like to keep those kind of people out. There might be other user classes who are, yes, they're going to use the product, but we're not going to really pay attention to their needs. They're going to get what we give them. But we have a bunch of other user classes who are maybe more or less equal in terms of providing input. So stakeholder analysis, user class analysis is a really important part of the start for laying a foundation for this collaborative partnership. Now let me show you why customer involvement is so important. My first book, written in 1996, is called Creating a Software Engineering Culture, and describes a bunch of principles that I think are critical for teams to keep in mind as they work together to build good products in a sensible way and hopefully have a good time in the process. And one of those 14 principles is that customer involvement is the most critical factor in software quality. I still believe that today. Here's kind of how that works. Suppose we could draw a picture that shows what happens over time. And what happens over time is that the customer's needs maybe evolve, or perhaps our understanding of them evolves in some direction. But what the developer builds often moves in some perhaps slightly different direction. You may have seen this happen. In fact, some people have suggested to me maybe those lines never come together, but I like to think we start on the same wavelength. Now, if we don't control this, then at the end of the project we have an expectation gap, a gulf between what people thought they were going to get or needed and what people actually have delivered. And this always comes as a rude surprise. My experience in software has been that surprises are never good news. And when someone shows you their new system and it really isn't what you had in mind, we've got an issue we have to deal with. So we want to try to build a collaborative partnership so that we can minimize those kinds of expectation gaps. So some steps to keep in mind when you do this are, first of all, to identify stakeholders. And I suggest you cast a very wide net to try to identify as many stakeholders as you can to make sure that their important needs are identified and addressed. Then we need to identify the specific user classes, and then, and this is very important, we need to think about who will be the literal voice of the customer for each of these user classes. I call these people product champions. Someone is going to have to speak for the needs of each group. So we'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. If you can, try to get the key players here, the customer representatives, the BA, the developers. Let's try to get them to work together as closely physically as we can. Not always possible. Very early on, we're going to have to talk about how we will collaborate. This is something that groups of people who work together often don't do. And I can give you an example of the benefits of doing this. When I wrote the third edition of the Software Requirements book, starting 2.5 years ago or so, I was working for the first time with a co-author, Joy Beatty. And I hardly knew Joy. So we spent actually a lot of time talking about how we were going to collaborate long distance on this rather hefty book of 650 pages, as it turned out. And you know, the time we spent discussing how we're going to work together was worth every minute, because the collaboration went very smoothly and I think very effectively, and was fun too. It was a lot of work, but it was fun. Along the way here, we want to agree on the rights that our customers have with respect to requirements and the responsibilities that they have. Chapter 2 of the Software Requirements 3rd Edition book addresses this very topic in quite a lot of detail. So let me talk a little bit about this product champion idea, a matter of really exploring how we can have some people serve as the primary interface between the development and customer communities. This is not a new idea. You know, some people talk about on-site customers as if it's a new thing, but we actually started this idea of the product champion in a small group I worked in at Kodak 30 years ago, 1985. We decided this was a critical part of how we were going to build software for our internal users. Ideally, these people will be real users. They won't be the managers of the users or the funding sponsor who should be delivering business requirements but not detailed functionality. And they shouldn't be probably the developer saying, gee, if I was a user, here's what I'd want. So let's try to get real users to perform this role. Now, they can't just speak for themselves. They have to represent the needs of a community, a user class, as a representative kind of mode. And so a lot of the things that we have to have our product champions help us with is to resolve conflicting requirements. You might get a requirement from one person in a particular user class that says do A, and somebody else in that group says do B. Somebody else in a third user class might say do C. Well, maybe you can only do one of those. So somebody's going to have to make these decisions. And a product champion who is real close to the user needs can help us reconcile those kinds of conflicts. So the goal is to have product champions work with the business analysts so we can present the developers with a unified set of requirements. And this really only works when the product champions have the authority to make binding decisions on these kinds of requirements-related issues. If they can only make suggestions and someone else is making a decision, then their influence is really somewhat restricted. We found it really helpful to document the product champion responsibilities so that when we were talking with people about performing this role, they had an idea of what they were getting in for. So in our experience, projects that had product champions had a much higher probability of being successful than others, and I've talked to many other people who've had the same experience. Well, the fifth critical success factor is rigorous and ongoing prioritization. I had a friend once who said that the last phase of every software project, no matter what life cycle you were following, the last phase was the rapid de-scoping phase. And I just love that phrase, the rapid de-scoping phase. Doesn't that give you a great mental image of throwing stuff overboard to try to get the boat in to shore before it sinks? And it's really true. So what we need to do is recognize that not everything can be top priority. And we're going to have to try to reach some balance between the value and the cost of implementing each requirement so that we can make sure that we're always working on the most important things in the right sequence so we can make good trade-off decisions when we've got to do this versus that and can't do it all, at least not now, and when we have to deal with new requirements or modified requirements. Ongoing dynamic reprioritization of the work that remains to be done in the product backlog, that's a centerpiece of agile development. And it should also be a practice that all projects perform. There's nothing intrinsic about that says, gee, only do this on agile projects. Rigorous and ongoing prioritization is something that every project needs. But this can become a very politically charged and emotional kind of argument. People think their requirements are important and your requirements are not. Well, we have to find some way to make this a little bit more analytical if we can. So you might think in terms of what makes it favorable to implement one particular requirement versus another, and that's really a function of how much customer value it's going to deliver. And we can further split customer value into two aspects. One is the benefit that the customers are going to get if that capability is present. The other is the penalty that we might have if we don't include it for some reason. But we need to balance that customer value favorability indicator against things that might make it less desirable to implement one function versus another. And those unfavorability indicators are a matter of the technical risk associated with implementing it and the cost. You might decide to implement, 3 relatively simple, low-risk features as opposed to one complex feature that's expensive if they provide comparable value. So we have to make those kinds of decisions. So one thought process I find helpful here is to think about which requirements are most important and which ones are most urgent. Our book actually describes several prioritization techniques. One of the simplest is a 3-level scale. If you're using a 3-level scale, then no matter what words you give the levels, they boil down to high, medium, and low. The problem comes because most people don't precisely define what it means for a requirement to be high priority, medium priority, or low priority. I was teaching a class at one company once where somebody said, in our company, it's not politically correct to consider something to be low priority, so our priority levels are high, super high, and incredibly high. Well, if it's 3 levels, that still doesn't change the fact that they're high, medium, and low. But what do those mean? So here's how I think about it, going back to this idea of importance and urgency. That's an idea I got from Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And so when I think about this, and obviously, it's not just binary, urgent or not urgent. There's a scale there. But let's think of something that's important. It's a capability the customer must have, and it's urgent. It's something that must be included in the next release. I call that high priority. In fact, if a particular function could wait till a later release, by definition, my definition, it is not high priority. Okay, so that's an example of a medium priority requirement. It's a capability we're going to have to include, but it could wait till a later release or a later iteration. Those are medium priority, and so we don't have to do those right away. The third category here is stuff that's not very important and not very urgent. So those are low priority. Yeah, it'd be nice to have if we can fit it in, but if not, it's not going to be traumatic. So those are my definitions of high, medium, and low. And I really take a hard line on this. If something cannot be deferred, if it has to be in the next release, only then is it high priority. Now there's this fourth quadrant, and I've put this little symbol here to suggest that it's a danger zone. Those are things that seem like they're urgent, but they're really not important in providing customer values. So let's not do those. So if you can have people agree on stakeholders agree on priorities through a conversation and a handshake, that's great. Let's keep prioritization simple. But sometimes you need a more analytical approach. So our book actually describes a spreadsheet tool that you can use to go through a more rigorous prioritization assessment if that's helpful to you. All right, we're nearing the end here. The sixth critical success factor is to take an incremental and iterative approach to requirements development. The fact is you can't get all the requirements up front, and you can't get all the requirements right up front. I like to start at a high level of abstraction and kind of work down this business requirements, user requirements, functional requirements change. So maybe I can do a first cut of elicitation, maybe identify some use cases, learn just enough about those so that I can prioritize those. And then I can say, all right, let's take the ones that we're going to do for the next release or iteration, and let's flesh those out into more detail so that you're not detailing requirements prematurely and unnecessarily. And you have to expect that this is not just a one-pass operation. You're going to have to go back and revisit requirements periodically to refine them, to clarify things that we didn't understand yet or thought we did and turns out we're wrong, to extend them when there's something that's more complex than we realized, and to modify them when necessary. So the key phrase that I keep in mind here is progressive refinement of details. I think about going through a series of layers to try to reveal the knowledge about requirements in a little bit more detail at the right time. So let me say a little bit about how this works in this whole domain of requirements engineering. I subdivide requirements engineering into the two major categories of requirements development and requirements management. Requirements development involves all the things you do to get and represent good requirements. Requirements management has to do with, okay, what happens afterwards as life takes place, okay? So let's focus on requirements development here, and there are 4 subcategories of activities. The first is elicitation, the things we do to try to get requirements knowledge. I don't like to say gathering requirements, because that makes it sound like a simple collection process. And there's an element of that, of course, but there's also a discovery element, an exploration, and an invention element. So elicitation covers all of those kinds of things. And then we have to do some analysis on some group of requirements we've elicited. And analysis might involve breaking them down into further detail, representing them in other forms, such as by drawing diagrams, prioritizing, and that sort of thing. And as you do that, you might find you have to go back and do a little bit more elicitation to clarify something that you had heard earlier, and now you have some questions. We're going to take what we've learned and specify that into some shareable form, and you might find as you do that that you find some gaps. So we have to go back and do a little more analysis to close some of those gaps. We need to validate the requirements to convince ourselves that in fact these are the right requirements and will meet our needs and hopefully help us build the right product. And when you do that, you might find some ambiguous or unclear requirement specifications that you have to go back and fix. You may have to go back and do a little more analysis and even maybe go back and do some more elicitation. So this gets at this idea of requirements development being incremental and iterative. You know, it's just the nature of the human communication aspect of what we're doing here. So don't plan on this being a nice sequential, linear, left to right kind of operation. It just doesn't work that way. Well, the 7th factor here is the fact that requirements change. You know, it's a cosmic truth. It doesn't matter if you like that. It doesn't matter if you hope that it won't or imagine that it won't or pretend that it won't. Requirements are going to change. So we need to establish mechanisms to anticipate and accommodate this very real and often very important, valuable change. So to anticipate change, first of all, recognize that requirements are going to grow and build mechanisms in place to deal with it. What people usually do is they get some requirements, they provide an estimate of when they're going to be done, and people take that as a promise, a commitment, not anticipating the reality that probably when we're done with this project, months or years down the road, it's going to be rather larger than we think it is today. So you have to build in some ways to anticipate that this change and growth are going to take place. Let's understand our users and what's driving their business so we can get a sense of, is this likely to change fast? Is it likely to get a lot bigger, or is it relatively stable and mature? Look for likely sources of change so you can keep your eyes on those and not be so surprised when it happens. Then we need to be able to accommodate it. So let's think about your team's capacity to adapt to change. Depending on how you're working, you know, if you have a small group of people working in a co-located environment and a lot of dynamic interactions in the course of a day, they can probably adapt pretty quickly. If you've got people working in development shops in multiple places spread across the planet, that could be harder because of the communication involved. Also try to structure applications to facilitate change if you know that there are certain parts of it that are more likely to do that. A good example of that is the tax code. You know, tax laws change all the time, tax brackets change, these sorts of things happen. So if I'm writing a tax application, I'm going to anticipate what parts of it are more likely to change and see if we can make it easy to respond to that when necessary. And then we have to manage the change. We need mechanisms in place, such as tools to collect and manage, track change requests. You need a change control process. And you can access a sample change control process, again, at my website, processimpact.com. And follow it. You know, this is not rocket science, despite the graphic on this slide. Every organization has to deal with change. They can all have pretty similar change control processes, and it has to be practical and effective. So make sure that you follow it, and if it doesn't work for you, change it, and then follow the new one. One aspect of this is to evaluate the impact of a proposed change before you say, sure, no problem, we can do that. Let's see what we're getting into before we make that promise. So here are a few strategies to keep in mind around change. As you're doing requirements development, use best practices for elicitation and customer engagement, because a lot of change happens because we missed requirements. So maybe we didn't do a very good job of elicitation, maybe we didn't identify some key stakeholders and have good representatives for those. As I suggested earlier, let's define our project scope so that we can answer this question with each proposed change that comes up. Is this in scope? If the answer is yes, we deal with it. If the answer is no, maybe we just say no or we defer it to a later time. But you need to have that scope boundary so you can even have that conversation. We can be a little more rigorous and define requirements baselines, which are establishing a set of requirements that we're intending to implement for each chunk of the work that we do. And that's our reference against which change is proposed and dealt with. To put into place a change control system, start with a process, and then make sure we know who's going to be making decisions for proposed changes. This group of people is typically called a Change Control Board, or CCB, because somebody has to make those decisions, and we need to have a mechanism for agreeing on how we make those decisions. And make sure the changes that we accept are aligned with achieving our business outcomes. Around project management, one of the things you can do is choose an appropriate development life cycle. Agile development life cycles are especially intended to adapt with ongoing volatile change, but not all projects are like that. There are projects that can be defined reasonably well up front and are going to be reasonably stable over time. So choose an appropriate life cycle based on how much change you think you're going to have to cope with. And build in contingency buffers to your project plans to accommodate the reality of requirements growth. Otherwise, if you don't plan for the growth and just make the estimates and commitments based on what you know at the moment, then the first new feature that comes along will trash your plans and make it impossible to meet your commitments. Formal risk management is also a best practice around this domain. So I'm a big fan of risk management, something that you really ought to learn about. All right, so I've whizzed through a lot of stuff here in the past 45 minutes or so to talk about some of these factors that I think can really help you do a better job with requirements on your project. So here are some things for you to do next. First, take a look at the points of pain in your organization. If you don't think your requirements processes are working as well as you'd like, do a little root cause analysis to try to figure out why that is. You know, where are we falling short of what we'd like to be accomplishing, and why is that? That gives you some specific practices that you can select to try to address the root causes of those pain. There's a lot of industry good practices. That's what our book is really based on, is good practices, not a methodology. But around you, you've probably got other people who have got a lot of experience that we can leverage from. So borrow that information. Develop for your organization a set of procedures and templates and work aids that are practical, no bigger than they need to be, but allow your teams to work effectively and efficiently in a consistently good way. Train the project participants. It's not reasonable to expect people to work in a hard area like this without the necessary knowledge and background. So I think training is extremely important, not just for BAs, but for other people who are involved with the requirements in the project as well. Be very open about sharing what you've learned with other people you work with. You're all on the same side here, so be open with knowledge. And really keep in mind that this is a communication problem. Requirements is not so much a technical problem, it's a communication problem. So let's look for techniques that are going to help us communicate more effectively among the stakeholders on the project. So the reason that I think it's helpful to keep these ideas in mind and look for good practices that will help you work more effectively is to reduce that unpleasant surprise factor that happens at the end of so many projects. I don't really like surprises. I haven't found them to be good news, and so we'd like to try to avoid that as much as we can. Actually, I did think of an eighth critical success factor, and that's this book that Joy and I wrote. It's got a lot of good information in it, and I think it can probably help with almost all of these areas. So thanks very much for joining us today. I'd like to thank Digibytes for sponsoring this presentation. And if you take away only one idea from this talk, keep in mind that without high-quality requirements, software is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. So we do have time for some questions here. Let me scan through some of these questions and see if I can pick out anything. Let's see here. Somebody asked about any requirements management tools that I like. You know, there's probably 35 to 40 requirements management tools that are commercially available. I do not even attempt to stay current on those. The vendors change all the time. The features change all the time. New ones come and go. New ones come and old ones go. So I don't even try to stay current on that. And besides, a tool that would work great in one place might not be appropriate for another one because of the nature of the project or the size of the project or the culture. So I tend not to give specific tool recommendations just because there's too many variables. Here's a suggestion or a question. Do you feel that joint application development or JAD sessions are effective at identifying requirements? And the short answer is yes, I do. And I would broaden the concept of a joint application development session to really being a collaborative requirements elicitation workshop where we have maybe a handful of users like the product champions I was talking about, and we have a facilitator who often is the business analyst, and we have I like to have a developer in the workshop as well to kind of be listening in the back and thinking, gee, do we know how to do that? And raise their hand once in a while and say, nobody knows how to do what you just requested. Or, yeah, we can do that, but it's going to be really expensive. How badly do you need it? So let's get that voice of feasibility reality. I like to have users involved in these kinds of things so that we can get input from multiple perspectives, but they have to be facilitated very effectively. You need to have someone who's going to really keep the session on track and focus. But in general, yes, I do think that collaborative elicitation sessions, workshops like that, are really going to be important. Let's see. Here's a question: how to understand will you be a successful BA in the future? You know, that's a really hard question because you know, there's a lot of different people who are in this field now. But I think really, if you want to ask yourself that question, do you think you're going to be an effective BA? I would go back to that list of skills that I had. And incidentally, all of this information is in the book, so you can go back and look at that in detail. But I had this long list of skills that a typical BA ought to try to build over time. And I would ask each of you to, or invite you to go look at that list and just ask yourself, how confident do I feel in my own skills in each of these areas? Because I think that you can enhance those skills, but you have to want to. And you know, a lot of people are interested in professional certifications, and I think that's a very different question from necessarily just being able to get the knowledge that you have and apply it effectively. So certification gets you part of the ways, but not all the way. Somebody said, and I agree with this, strong negotiation skills is important for a BA. Very good point, Philip. Thank you for bringing that up. Couldn't agree more. It's definitely something BAs often have to do. Let's see. What do you suggest if the customer is in the government or public sector? And I guess I'm not sure what the difference would be. There is one huge difference between whether you're building software for people down the hall from you, you know, in your same government agency or your own company, or you might have ready access to real users who can serve as product champions or other sources of input. Comparing that to product development of a commercial product where you may not really have access to users in the same way, and you may have to do focus groups where focus groups typically can provide input and feedback and maybe try out prototypes, but focus groups don't usually have any decision-making authority. So that's a different kind of situation. So I think that's more important than whether you're particularly in the public sector versus the private sector. Okay, here's a question. Requirements grow, deal with it. When to raise a flag? Well, what I think you need to do is anticipate at the beginning of the project that there's going to be growth and just accept that there's going to be a certain amount, and maybe you can estimate whether 10% growth over the requirements over the 6-month period is likely or not, and whether you could handle that. I'd raise a flag if I started seeing requirements coming and going in and out of scope, suggesting people haven't really understood the scope boundary very well. I'd raise the flag if new stakeholders kept coming out of the woodwork suggesting that we had maybe missed something there, or if when we have a review we discover that we've missed a lot of requirements and maybe haven't done a good job of elicitation. So you just really have to kind of keep your eyes open there and see if the amount of change and growth you're encountering, the volatility you're encountering is far beyond what you anticipated and feel like you can realistically handle. Well, I think we're out of time for questions. Thank you for those. Again, thank you for joining us today, and I'll hand it back to Chris.
Thank you very much, Karl, for the very informative presentation. I'd like to thank all of you here today for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar. I'd like to remind everyone that today's webinar, along with the slides, will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com within a few days. This concludes today's event. Have a great day.